The wind howled across the vast, frozen expanse of the lake, the kind of wind that carried a sharp sting with every gust. It tugged at the edges of the trees, their bare limbs trembling against the chill, but it was the stillness that truly unsettled the man. It was too quiet, no birds calling, no distant rustle of movement, just the sound of the wind, carrying a bitter coldness that seemed to freeze the air itself. As he stepped closer to the lake, his boots crunching heavily in the snow, his eyes caught a small dark shape on the ice. For a moment he thought it might be a trick of the wind, a shadow cast in the wrong light, but as he drew nearer, his heart tightened. A puppy, barely visible against the whiteness of the snow, lay motionless near the edge of the ice. The small, fragile body was half covered by the frozen ground, its fur matted with frost. The puppy's chest rose and fell faintly, a shallow breath, but its body was still, and its tiny form seemed lost against the expanse of cold. He knelt beside it, his breath coming out in short, sharp puffs in the freezing air. The puppy's fur, stiff with cold, didn't move, and for a moment it seemed as though it had already slipped away. But then he felt it. A faint stir beneath his fingers, a small flutter of breath that was barely there, but enough to tell him the puppy was still clinging to life. The wind seemed to pause as he lifted the puppy from the frozen ground, cradling it gently in his hands. Every movement was careful, deliberate. The ice beneath him creaked, but he didn't hesitate, taking slow steps toward solid ground. His fingers ached from the cold, the numbness creeping into his bones, but he kept his focus on the fragile creature in his arms. The puppy didn't stir, its body limp and unresponsive, but the faint rise and fall of its chest was all he needed to guide his steps. The air, thick with cold, pressed in around him, but he did not hurry. Each step forward was filled with the weight of the moment, the knowledge that the life he carried in his arms was as fragile as the ice beneath his feet. There was no rush, no frantic panic, only the slow, deliberate movement of someone determined to save what little could be saved. Once on solid ground, he knelt down, his fingers numb from the cold, gently laying the puppy down on a patch of snow. Its small body lay still, almost lifeless, but there was a faint rhythmic rise and fall of its chest. The man's hands hovered over it, not sure of what more he could do, but unwilling to leave. In the silence, he could hear nothing but the wind. He didn't speak, didn't try to call out or make any noise. He simply watched, waiting, hoping. The puppy's stillness seemed to hold the world at bay. There was no sign of struggle, no weak bark or whimper, just the soft pulse of life, fragile and uncertain. It didn't cry out, and it didn't move. It was as if the puppy knew the gravity of the situation just as the man did. There was only the cold, the wind, and the quiet, waiting. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the warmth seeping into the room, but it did little to quiet the weight in the man's chest. He sat beside the puppy, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he gently laid it on a soft blanket by the fire. The small body, stiff and still, did not stir. Each breath the puppy took was shallow and uneven, a faint rise and fall of its tiny chest that seemed so fragile, so thin, as though it could slip away with the slightest breeze. The man didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The silence in the room seemed to fill every corner, amplifying the weight of the puppy's condition. The icy cold that had gripped it on the lake had sunk deep into its bones, and even now, its body remained impossibly cold to the touch. He stayed close, kneeling beside it, his eyes never leaving the still form. His fingers, careful and slow, began to rub the puppy's legs, coaxing warmth into the frozen limbs. The motions were soft, the pressure gentle, as though he feared even the smallest shift could shatter the fragile thread of life that still lingered. The man's breath was quiet, steady. The wind outside howled, battering against the walls and windows, but inside, everything was still. The only sound that broke the silence was the soft crackle of the fire, the slow hiss of wood turning to ash. He did not rush, did not force. He allowed the silence to stretch, thick and heavy, filled with the quiet hum of waiting. It was a strange kind of waiting, full of doubt yet somehow tethered to the smallest shred of hope. The man's movements were deliberate, slow, as if he understood the weight of each breath the puppy took. He could feel the uncertainty, the helplessness in his own chest, but he did not let it drive him to act in haste. There was no frantic search for a solution. There was no immediate plan. Just the gentle rubbing of frozen limbs, the warmth of the fire, and the hope that time and nature would know what to do. He could hear the wind outside, its fierce howling muffled by the walls of the cabin. It had been a long day, and the hours seemed to stretch endlessly as the room remained still. The puppy's shallow breath continued, so slow, so fragile, but at least it was still breathing. The man rested his hand lightly on the puppy's side, feeling the faint rhythm of its chest, the life that still clung to its small body. He kept the room calm, and though there was an overwhelming sense of helplessness, there was also a quiet determination to stay with it, to trust that in the stillness, something would change. The man never let his gaze leave the puppy's form. His mind focused on the delicate task of restoring what had been lost. The air inside the cabin felt warmer now, but it was a warmth that was only half-hearted, barely able to touch the coldness that still held the puppy. Still, the flames in the hearth offered what they could, flickering softly in the quiet space, as though holding their breath alongside him. The puppy remained still, its tiny form resting on the blanket, but its body no longer felt as stiff. The quiet continued, and with it, the tiniest of shifts, the slowest of changes in the puppy's chest. The man didn't speak aloud, but he hoped, silently, that in time the puppy would feel the warmth more deeply, that it would respond to the soft care he had offered. There was nothing else to do but wait, to stay present, to hold the small, fragile creature in the calm and quiet that filled the room. It was a waiting that felt like an eternity, but also a timeless moment, suspended between what had happened and what could still happen. In the silence, as the fire's warmth slowly filled the air, the man remained. His hand continued to hover gently over the puppy, the room filled with the unspoken bond between them. Time passed slowly, but in that quiet space, the presence of life was undeniable, and the man's hope, faint but real, held steady. The room remained still, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. The puppy, wrapped in warmth, lay on the blanket beside the hearth, its small body still and unresponsive. An hour had passed, yet the puppy's condition had not improved. The man sat close, his eyes never leaving the fragile form. There was a heavy weight in the air, a tension that seemed to settle deeper with each passing moment. Every shallow breath from the puppy felt like a reminder of just how delicate life could be, and he could feel his own heart tightening as he watched, waiting. His thoughts drifted briefly to what might happen next, the small flickers of doubt creeping in. Perhaps he had been too late. Maybe the puppy's body had already been claimed by the cold. He exhaled slowly, the warmth from the fire offering a little comfort against the weight of the uncertainty. But then, as though nature itself had heard his silent concerns, a tiny sound cut through the silence. At first, he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. It was so faint, so quiet, that it could have been nothing more than the wind pressing against the walls of the cabin. But then it came again, a small whimper, barely audible, slipping from the puppy's lips. The man's breath caught. It was a sound so soft it barely registered, but it was unmistakably there. A faint stir of life, a tiny cry that spoke volumes. His hand trembled as he reached down, fingers brushing the puppy's tiny chest, and for a moment he felt it. There, beneath the cold fur, a soft pulse, slow but steady. He dared not move too quickly, afraid that even the slightest disturbance might break the fragile moment. Instead, he remained still, his hand resting gently on the puppy's side, as though his presence alone might help guide it back to life. He watched, waiting for any further sign, his heart now beating in time with the little pulse beneath his fingertips. And then, ever so slowly, the puppy's eyes fluttered open. They were dull, unfocused, far from alert, but in them the faintest spark of life remained. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The man's voice was barely a whisper, more to himself than to the puppy. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. The words were simple, but in them there was a quiet promise. He gently stroked the puppy's fur, the delicate touch a silent reassurance. The puppy's body shifted, a small, hesitant movement that made the man's breath catch. It wasn't much, a twitch of the paw, a subtle stirring, but it was enough to change the air in the room. It wasn't a miracle, not yet, but it was something, and in that small movement the man felt the first spark of hope. He could still feel the faint pulse beneath his hand, the warmth beginning to spread in its small body. The silence in the room deepened again, but now it was filled with something different, something softer, more hopeful. The man stayed close, not daring to pull away. He didn't rush, didn't try to force anything. The puppy needed time. It was too soon to know what would happen next, but for the first time since finding it on the lake, there was a sense of cautious hope in the air. The fire burned steadily beside them, and outside, the wind continued to howl against the walls, but inside, the world had narrowed to the faint, steady rhythm of life returning. For the man, it was enough. It was the smallest of signs, but in it he found the quiet determination to wait, to stay present in the stillness. Whatever came next, he would be there. The journey had only just begun. By morning, the fire still burned low, its warmth enveloping the small cabin in a quiet glow. The wind outside had softened, though the remnants of the night's cold still clung to the air. The puppy, now nestled more comfortably on the blanket, had begun to show small signs of life. Its eyes, though still clouded and unfocused, were no longer the dull, empty gaze they had been the night before. There was a flicker of awareness in them now, a soft glimmer that had not been there before. The man sat beside the puppy, his eyes never straying far. The night had been long, filled with soft whispers of hope and silence, but now, as the first light of day filtered through the small window, there was something new. The puppy's small body remained still, but the shallow rise and fall of its chest was more steady, more assured. There was no urgency in the man's movements, no rush to see the puppy leap or run. Instead, he simply watched, his heart quietly lifting with each tiny, fragile sign of progress. He had hardly slept, his eyes heavy with the weight of worry, but now, as he sat there in the quiet light of morning, the world outside seemed distant as the cold air that had come before. The puppy, curled close to the warmth of the fire, lay still, its coat now beginning to show the first signs of life returning. The man's hand, trembling slightly from exhaustion, hovered over the small form. He did not reach to touch the puppy immediately. Instead, he simply sat, watching it with patience. There was nothing to hurry for, no pressing need to push the small animal further than it was willing to go. Slowly, the puppy's head lifted. It was a hesitant movement, slow and unsure, but it was enough. The man remained still, his gaze fixed on the small, fragile creature before him. His heart tightened in his chest as he held his breath, afraid that the slightest motion would break the delicate spell of calm that had settled over the room. The puppy's eyes, still unfocused, glanced up at him, but there was no frantic movement, no sharp sounds of distress. The puppy simply lay there, uncertain, its body trembling faintly from the aftershock of its ordeal, but the stillness was no longer a sign of danger. It was a moment of quiet healing, one that the man understood in the depths of his quiet presence. He extended his hand, open and calm, offering it without force. There was no rush in his movement, no eagerness to make the puppy respond. He simply let his hand rest before it, palm up, fingers slightly curled, waiting. The puppy's eyes shifted toward the hand, and for a moment there was stillness, an uncertain pause. Then, with a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, the puppy nudged the man's hand with its nose. The touch was gentle, tentative, as though it was unsure whether to trust. But it was there. A brief and fragile contact, the softest of gestures, but one that carried more weight than any bark or whimper could have. The man's breath caught in his chest. There was no celebration, no loud exclamation of relief. Instead, he smiled softly, his eyes closing for a moment as the first true smile he had allowed himself since finding the puppy curved across his face. It was not a smile of triumph, but one of quiet recognition, a recognition of something more profound than survival. It was the recognition of trust beginning to form. The puppy's small body trembled again, but the trembling was different now. It was not from the cold, nor from fear, but from the slow, steady rebuilding of strength. The puppy shifted its position just slightly, curling itself closer to the warmth of the fire. The man did not reach for it again. He allowed the puppy to choose when it was ready for more. He stayed close, though, his gaze never leaving the small form that had begun to stir in the warmth of the cabin. For the man, there was no rush. The world outside might have continued with its frozen winds and its harsh weather, but inside the cabin, there was a quiet peace that had settled into the air. It was not just the warmth from the fire or the soft, steady breaths of the puppy. It was the space between them, the space filled with a growing trust, fragile but real. The man knew the journey ahead was still uncertain. The puppy had much farther to go, but this small moment, this quiet exchange, was enough for now. It was a promise of what could come, and it was a quiet beginning. As the hours passed, the puppy's movements became a little more steady. Its head lifted further, and its eyes, still unfocused, seemed to search for something, but the searching was no longer frantic. It was simply looking, taking in the space, its surroundings, and the presence of the man beside it. There was no whimpering, no desperate need for comfort. The puppy was simply existing, slowly, carefully, as if learning to trust its own body again. The man watched, his hand resting lightly on the floor beside him. He did not reach for the puppy again, but his fingers itched to offer more support, more care. He could feel the urge to protect, to fix, but instead, he let the moment unfold. He understood, in that soft space, that healing was not something that could be forced. It was not something that could be rushed. It was something that had to be allowed, something that had to happen in its own time. The puppy shifted again, this time lifting its body just enough to move slightly closer to the fire. The man watched closely, his heart steady but full. There was no change in the puppy's condition that would be noticed by the outside world, no dramatic shift that would signal a clear victory. But for the man, the quiet shift of the puppy's movement, the small, unspoken decision to stay close to the warmth, was a victory in itself. The world outside remained cold and distant, but inside the cabin there was warmth. There was trust, fragile and quiet, but real. And in that space between the man and the puppy there was a bond slowly forming, not through grand gestures but through the simplest, most honest exchange of presence. The journey ahead would still be long, but for now, in this quiet moment, they were not alone. And that, the man understood, was enough. The days passed, the steady rhythm of time marking the quiet recovery of the puppy. The fire no longer felt like the only source of warmth. The tiny body beside it began to hold warmth of its own, its coat no longer stiff and heavy with frost. The trembling, tentative movements had faded, replaced by a subtle strength that showed itself in the smallest of gestures. The puppy's legs, once wobbly and unsure, now carried it more confidently. It began to stand, its body no longer burdened by cold, no longer in danger of slipping away. The man, who had watched over it in those first fragile days, now watched with quiet joy as the puppy's once shallow breaths deepened, as its eyes began to clear. their cloudiness replaced by a faint spark of recognition. The subtle shifts in its movements, the slow return of its strength, marked the turning of a page, the beginning of something new. The bond between the man and the puppy had been built slowly, carefully, with every gesture of care, every gentle touch, and every soft word. It was not a bond forged in grand moments, but in these quiet, unspoken exchanges. And yet, with each passing day, something else had changed. The puppy no longer looked to the man with uncertainty. Its eyes, though still soft and unsure, now reflected something more than just survival. It was no longer the fragile creature pulled from the frozen lake, no longer the small, trembling form that had fought for breath and warmth. It was becoming something else, something more self-assured. And as the days grew warmer and the snow began to soften, the man could feel the shift, the pull of something beyond the cabin, beyond the warmth of the fire. One afternoon, as the light filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over the small cabin, the man knew that the time had come. The puppy, now stronger and steadier on its legs, had been looking toward the door. Its movements were more deliberate, more curious, as though the world outside had begun to call to it. The open spaces, the wild that lay just beyond the threshold, were beginning to stir something deep within it. The man, who had once cradled the fragile form in his arms, now felt that the moment was upon them. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting, and walked to the door. He opened it, stepping aside and looking back at the puppy. It paused for a moment, uncertain, its small body tense. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh snow. The wind had calmed, and there was a quiet stillness in the world beyond the cabin. The puppy stood at the threshold, sniffing the air. Its nostrils flared as it took in the unfamiliar scents, its ears pricked, and for the first time there was something more than curiosity in its eyes. There was recognition of the world it had once known, of the space it belonged to. The man watched, his heart heavy, but filled with something else too, something deep, something that told him the time had come. The puppy took a slow step forward, then another. It hesitated, looking back at the man, and the man held his breath. The connection between them, though unspoken, was deep, but he didn't call to it. He didn't urge it on. The decision was the puppy's, just as the journey had always been its own. With a small wag of its tail, the puppy stepped fully into the snow-covered ground outside the cabin, its tiny body moving toward the wild. The man stood at the doorway, watching as it moved farther from him, its small form fading into the landscape, blending with the trees and the snow. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the world. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and the air was filled with the quiet rustle of the wind. The man remained standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the puppy, now a small dark shape moving slowly toward the forest. The connection between them was still there, invisible but strong, a thread that could not be broken. He did not move to follow. He did not call out. There was no need for words, no need for action. The puppy was free now, ready to continue its journey, and so was he. The man's heart was full, not with sorrow, but with something quieter, more profound. The puppy had come to him when it needed help, and now it was leaving on its own, strong and whole. In the distance, the trees whispered, their branches swaying in the soft evening breeze. The last rays of the sun touched the snow, turning it a pale gold. The man stood in the doorway, the fading warmth of the day filling the space around him. He felt no urge to chase, no regret, just a deep, quiet gratitude for the time they had shared. The puppy, now a small speck in the distance, faded into the forest, its form slowly disappearing among the trees. The man took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and then, just as quietly, closed the door. He didn't need to look back. The journey was no longer his to take, and with that, He knew it was time to let go. The soft rustle of the wind, the distant murmur of the trees, was the only sound that filled the cabin as he turned away, his heart light yet full. The world outside was vast, open, and waiting, and somewhere in it the puppy was moving toward its own place, its own path. The man smiled softly to himself, a quiet, tender smile that held no sorrow, only the quiet understanding that some journeys were meant to be walked alone. And for the puppy, this was its moment, its freedom. The door closed softly behind him, and the man's heart was at peace.